Hello, everyone. Hi, it's Samantha Governor. Hi, it's Samantha Governor from the Wits School of Governance. Thank you so much for joining us for our first webinar. Today, we'll be looking at the impact of militarization during the COVID-19 period in South Africa. We don't have many house rules, just that if you do have comments and questions, please use the chat function. And should we not get through all of them today, then we can always engage via email if you need to continue the conversation. I will now hand over to Rekgotsofetse Chikane, who's our moderator.
Yeah. Welcome everyone. You are joining us on the first WSG webinar under these COVID-19 lockdown conditions. I hope everyone is not losing their minds completely in isolation and fully taking advantage of the opportunity to learn more, to gain more knowledge from topics you might not be aware of, or to even gain knowledge from topics that you're quite specialized in. These conversations will be running for the foreseeable future, hopefully on every 2 weeks, ranging from topics such as militarization to gender issues in the context of COVID-19, to how do you deal with health issues within the context of COVID-19. And we're working on more and more of these type of webinars, as well as hopefully in the future, public lectures. But today, we have two very amazing guests with us. We have Professor McCandless, who works at the School of Governance, and we have Professor William Gumede as well, who also works at the School of Governance. And they have written really interesting papers, and I hope, Samantha, at some point after this, we could link that to all the people who are visiting us today, focused on issues around militarization in the context of COVID-19. We are in uncertain times and unprecedented times. We haven't, as a nation, as a world, as a global community, ever had to really deal with the idea of what is it, the type of relationship we have with government when it says, please stay indoors and you have to do that. And how does that play out in a community that is as divided as South Africa, a community that is one of the most unequal in the world, and a community that has a very dark history when it comes to the presence of the military within communities in this country. And these type of themes make the question of militarization of South Africa very precedent. It makes it something that I think we really need to grapple with. When the lockdown first started, the images of police officers in the military in townships was often very reminiscent, and I say this as if I lived there, but reminiscent of the images you would see during apartheid. But the question is this the same South African National Defense Force? Is it the same South African police services? Some would argue that it's not, some would argue that it is. As one person who has unfortunately been on the wrong side of the public order police of the South African Police Service, at times I do feel like they're a bit heavy-handed. But is that necessary in the context of fighting a global pandemic? And hopefully we get to deal with that a bit more. I do want to give people the opportunity to use the comment section to ask any questions. We'll give our panelists the floor at first, and then after that, we're going to open it up. I might have a few questions, but if I really see that everyone else on this particular Zoom chat has much better questions than myself, we'll lean towards you guys. And without further ado, I'll give it to Professor McCandless to get us off.
Great. Well, I will also welcome you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. There's a lot of competition on these Zoom webinars right now, so we're grateful that you're with us. And also thanks to my colleagues for organizing this event, Samantha and Rekgotsofetse, as well as Lishe Mkombozi. I'll just dive right in. So, I mean, we know why we're here, to discuss the issue of increasing militarization in the issue of COVID, in the context of COVID-19 responses. And, you know, in South Africa, I mean, I think we're all well aware of the, I think it's now 30-something documented abuses by SANDF and SAPS. And, you know, problematically, this has been focused more in townships than in suburbs, and particularly invasive and draconian measures, as Rekgotsofetse was acknowledging, you know, and often with humiliation involved. And this is reminiscent for many South Africans of the character of apartheid level era authoritarianism. I think it's important to underscore that, this is of course a minority occurrence, right? In terms of those who have committed abuses. And sadly, however, small minorities can often create severe challenges for the reputations of majorities. And we need to acknowledge as well that these orders are these abuses are obviously not being ordered from above. And the president himself has made extraordinary efforts to promote that these interventions should be taken rather through compassion and kindness. So we're seeing a disconnect here that needs attention. But South Africa isn't unique, right? So we can, see that similar types of abuses are occurring around the world. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has identified South Africa, unfortunately, as one of 15 countries that, there are particularly concerning abuses where they're most troubling, alongside other countries such as Hungary and Poland and Philippines, Kenya, Iran. And many other academics are pointing to this authoritarianism revival around the world. So in addition to the heavy-handed military responses and police responses, there's also harsh clampdowns on the independence of the media and also on civil society being able to speak critically and to protest. And there's also a strong war discourse, right? And this is supposed to be against the pandemic. We're fighting the pandemic. And yet, the problem is it's often resulted in confusion with people being perceived as the enemy, despite the objective of protecting life. In Africa, we can see that, strong responses, heavy-handed responses are occurring in Kenya as well as Nigeria, particularly strong in Nigeria. And unlike in South Africa, where the authorities have at least admonished these abuses, in Kenya they've actually supported them, tried to support them, the police. And in Hungary we see a rule by decree by the president, and again clamped down on media. And in Poland we're seeing public restrictions on protests, while at the same time the ruling party is rolling back reproductive rights. In the Philippines, we're seeing the president ordering police to shoot dead anyone who doesn't obey the lockdown restrictions. And in the MENA region, we're seeing a reversion to authoritarian measures, which social movements, as we know, through the Arab Spring fought very hard to roll back. And while protesters around the world are enhancing and adapting their techniques in the context of the pandemic and being locked down, there are still concerns, particularly like in the MENA region, that the revolution will take actually much more violent measures once the lockdown is released, because people have been so disenfranchised and impoverished in the process. So we can see this is a very troubling trend, and it's not just South Africa. And we need to ask, why are emergency powers being used as a weapon against the people? And I'm sure we all have our own opinions on this, which I hope can be really, brought out during the discussion. My own sense is that it's a mixture of opportunism of politicians on the one hand, and ingrained cultures of violence when combined with power, which can easily just be a gun and a uniform, and easily abused. From a feminist perspective, as my colleague Darlene Miller, who's written this piece together, a couple of pieces actually, she refers to the abuses as rooted in cultures of toxic masculinity. So I hope we can discuss this more in when we open it up. And so what do we do about this? And of course, again, there's many perspectives, how we can handle this. And I look forward to hearing, again, all of your viewpoints on this. My own thoughts are that obviously we need to rethink the policies that are affecting the disadvantaged communities much more. And this is becoming a well-versed topic at the moment, but obviously it has to happen in the socioeconomic realm, but also in the security realm. And that's what we're focusing on today. So in particular, we need to focus on more attention on the how of service delivery to ensure that policies and implementation do not cause resentment in communities most affected, and which serves to undermine trust and legitimacy of the state. And we see this increasingly. People need to feel that they belong, and that that the service delivery is fair, and that they are included in processes and have a say in how it's done, in the design and delivery of such practices, and that these practices deliver on their expectations and agreements. And when this fails, and in particular when human rights violations are violated, or human rights are violated in the process, bonds and relationships around, with vis-a-vis the state and communities suffer greatly. And unfair delivery or punishment, as it were, can also cause resentment, not just with the state and vertically in society, but also horizontally with communities, with other communities. And this deeply affects social cohesion, which in turn affects the success of any policy and its implementation, whether it's in a normal development setting or in a crisis setting. And this is, of course, very important in the context of when we're talking about a social contract, or in South Africa, the term social compact is used more. And I'm not talking in the somewhat narrow sense that the president speaks of it, right? The president has generally referred to the social compact in an economic sense. And, I'm referring it to much more broadly, really about the dynamic agreement between state and society on how we are going to live together and how power and resources are distributed. And for such an agreement to contribute to peace and societal well-being and to longer-term transformative goals, it must be reflected in this everyday mechanisms and policies and responses that uphold this agreement. And this is especially true in times of crisis. In research that myself and many colleagues did across 9 countries on this question of what drives a resilient social contract, the South Africa case was particularly interesting, and not unlike our Tunisia case study, the authors, who were led by Masana Ndingakanga, argued that the strong culture of protest in South Africa is vital for forging a more nationally owned and people-driven social contract. And as protest is curtailed during times of emergency, it's all the more imperative that government finds ways to engage the populace at the community level and to work overtime to ensure that their needs and interests prominently feature in the crisis compact. So other specific efforts, just as I try to wind up here, we need more strident efforts to renounce the heavy-handedness of security sector responses. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has actually developed guidance on emergency and exceptional measures, which it's very important for all South Africans to know about. And these are exceptional measures that they're saying that exceptional measures must be necessary, proportionate to need, not arbitrary or discriminatory, and time limited. And the right to life is never negotiable. And emergency measures should be subject to public oversight measures, which I think we're seeing a lot of critique that this isn't occurring enough here. There also needs to be vigilant government commitment against the abuses that have taken place. And while the security sector leadership has publicly acknowledged that these have taken place, there needs to be more effort to communicate the progress of the investigation, and this should be done regularly to foster trust and accountability measures, to foster trust and accountability amongst the populace. And they also need to effectively reconcile with the families and communities that have been most harmed by these abuses. And of course, clearly there needs to be an upscale of training. I mean, particularly as the president has put the entire military on employment in this crisis. We need to make sure that the training is sufficient for them to respond, and that there are not more abuses of this nature. There also needs to be better communication and platforms for participation. And I think there's some wonderful examples emerging, really by social movements and community organizations and so forth, like this COVID-19 People's Coalition is doing some amazing work in terms of education in townships, and Global Governance Africa has produced some very interesting recommendations, underscoring the need for CIMIC, the Civil Military Coordination Officers, and female engagement teams that should be at the forefront of guiding community level law enforcement actions. And also that security sector needs to participate in local community efforts and engagements that are happening as well. So interfaith dialogues and inter-community cooperation efforts. And just lastly, I think, you know, this notion of social solidarity, which is kind of a precursor to the notion of social cohesion and really quite essential when we're thinking about how to foster a sense of unity in this crisis rather than division. Social solidarity is really forged when each segment of society works together to for the greater good. And we can see just incredible efforts in South Africa and around the world. And it's really quite important for our mental and emotional psyche that these are better circulated and shared to kind of, you know, strengthen the longer term transformation efforts in the country. So I will end there. Thank you. Not hearing you.
Sorry, there we go. Sorry. I was just saying that you made so many good and important points. The idea that the military has to always respect the right to life in the context where often it seems as if people become the enemy in the crisis such as a pandemic. And how do you navigate that type of situation? How do you deal with military and the South African police force being in a community in terms of in the time of a crisis, in communities that, like you said, often have the sense of an ingrained culture of violence. And when violence or protest is used as a way of communicating with government gets taken away by these processes, what does government then do? What do citizens do to engage with government? And I think these are very pressing questions. So I want to hand it over to Professor Gumede. I am noting some of the questions that are in the chat. Feel free again to use the chat as much as possible. I am taking my notes as well. But Professor Gumede, off to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for those of you who joined. And thank you for those who make this possible. You know, my colleagues at the School of Governance. I mean, I'll just talk, I think, initially much more broadly. I mean, enforcement per se really means limitation of rights. I mean, you know, a lockdown means a restriction on movement and so on. So it's a restriction of freedom, essentially. But broadly, you know, countries, there have been two extreme approaches on how to deal with the COVID-19 around the world. I mean, one, and most of them depended on the political culture of a country. I mean, you know, the two broad responses, one, much more democratic responses to deal with COVID-19. And we've seen that in many countries in Western Europe. You've seen this in Singapore, South Korea, and so on, where there was a much more softer lockdown with a little bit, you know, with much more freedoms involved. And then we had, you know, on the other side, which you have, you know, countries with strong autocratic cultures that have also enforced their lockdowns and their response to COVID-19, you know, in similar autocratic fashions. You talk about Indonesia, China, most of Africa, former Eastern Europe, you know, Hungary was mentioned, and so on. So, you know, these brought two different approaches to the, you know, to combating COVID-19. And the interesting thing, I mean, just interesting early observations really, that it seems that those countries that had a much more democratic approach has actually been much more effective. You think about, you know, Singapore and South Korea, I mean, certainly the most successful after COVID-19 fights around the world. And of course, you know, people will tell you, yes, but, you know, China and their autocratic approach achieve results quickly and so on. But I think more broadly, the countries really that have looked at or that have implemented their COVID-19 response in a much more human rights based, much more open way, much more transparent way, actually came up quicker and more sustainably out of, you know, out of the lockdowns. So that's just broadly speaking. I mean, just to come to the specifics, I mean, if you look at many African countries, and I'll start there and I'll come back to South Africa, most African countries, of course, are autocratic, even if they have elections. You know, many African countries have elections, but I mean, you know, they are not democracies. Election doesn't mean democracies. And most of them, the only, you know, the culture of response to any crisis in many African countries, you know, since the end of colonialism, has always been a really hard-handed autocratic response to crises. So, you know, that is where the political culture comes from. And many has responded exactly the same. Now, unfortunately, sadly, in many African countries, it's not just the autocratic response, but often what has happened, you know, the last couple of years in many African countries, some African governments, what they, you know, they have attacked critics or opposition of governments, civil society, or whether it's journalists and so on, either through one or two ways. So one way is, you know, if you criticize, you know, you would then be accused of promoting terrorism. Or now what has happened with, you know, COVID-19, you know, journalists, opposition party leaders, civil society organizations who've been critical of human rights abuses during this period has now been accused of undermining efforts to deal with a, you know, with a virus, or of spreading fake news and so on. So, you know, it's almost similar. So, you know, whereas prior to COVID-19, critics were attacked on the basis that they supposedly promote terrorism. Now they are attacked because, you know, they're spreading fake news about COVID-19, or they're undermining government's responses to COVID-19. I mean, wonder why would governments on the African continent, I mean, why have they responded in such tough ways? Now, one of the reasons really is lack of capacity to deal with, you know, with the crisis itself. If you compare African countries, I mean, the last couple of decades on the continent, we have had a number of epidemics, whether it's Ebola, cholera, HIV/AIDS, and so on. But compared to our peers in East Asia, we have not learned the lessons from our own epidemics. So we didn't build capacity post, I mean, even in South Africa, I mean, yes, we've dealt with an epidemic, HIV/AIDS epidemic, we have, you know, outbreaks of cholera and so on, but we never build a capacity, health capacity, expertise, and so on. If you look at South Korea, you look at China, Singapore, you know, they had MERS, then they had SARS, and they really built up their capacity immediately thereafter. So they were much better able to respond to COVID-19. But in the African context, really, we have not built capacity. And because we haven't built capacities, many African governments in fearful of that their own citizens will panic if they hear there is no capacity to deal with the virus, they respond autocratically. I mean, just give you an example. In Madagascar, for example, the government banned all radio talk-in programs because the government feared that people would criticize, you know, the government's response to COVID-19. I mean, things like that. And this is just, you know, it's across the continent. Okay. Now, if we come to South Africa, I mean, sadly, is that both the police and the military, since the end of apartheid, you know, we haven't what we've done with the police and what we've done with the military since the end of apartheid is that we've blackened it. You know, we've brought more Black people into it, but we have not transformed the culture. We have not made it a human rights based or democratic culture. Even in occasions when our military is abroad in peacekeeping missions, we haven't built a new type of policing or a new type of military that is much more democratically orientated, respect dignity, and so on. So we essentially, like, I mean, of course, it's not just the military and the police, but most of our institutions have changed color, but never changed the culture. Hasn't moved towards a constitutional culture, but institutions may have had now Black people, even sometimes women in places of management and so on. But we have not changed the culture, because transformation, as far as I'm concerned, is not about color alone. It is about changing into a democratic culture in all, from in personal life to workplace and in broader society. I think my time most probably is up. Is it?
I mean, you've got like a minute left.
Okay. So let me conclude with this minute. So I think, to conclude is, from a South African point of view, we need more oversight, really, over the military and the police and over government. That's very important. So, for example, when there were incidents about a military abusing citizens, I saw, one of our parliamentarians who actually sat on that oversight committee in Parliament said, no, we're actually supporting the military and attacking citizens. So no, that is not oversight from a parliament. If you're a parliamentarian, you're on the side of the citizens, on the side of the constitution, on the side of rights. And civil society must also, play oversight, the media, citizens, as citizens, we must do that. And maybe lastly, yesterday I saw somebody, the presidency, criticizing a citizen who had criticized the president. Now, in a democracy, you have the right to dissent and to have a different view and to criticize the president and the government's approach to any crisis. It is a right which is enshrined, and it's a right we should not allow as citizens, as civil society or the media, that a citizen or that government or anyone in power say you should not criticize because this is a crisis. In a crisis, criticism is important.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I do want to go straight by asking a question. So how I've been thinking about this militarization. So the minister, before the lockdown began, for about 2 days, went on a media campaign to try and assure citizens as much as possible that the role of the military within communities is for peace, right? To maintain peace, to maintain some sort of order, and that if there are any abuses committed by military officials, then citizens should report that. And she also made a point, and it touches on your idea of the transformation of the military. And she made this interesting point where she stated, well, the military that we have now is a military of a post-1994 South Africa. That the military personnel, the younger military personnel, never experienced the tactics or the use of tactics from the old apartheid regime. Almost as a justification to say the culture has completely changed. But then you see in the first weeks that maybe that culture wasn't a complete change. And this is not to paint the entire military as bad, right? There's so many different cases of the military doing good for citizens. As someone in the chat mentioned, that often the cameras will catch what people want to see and to fit their particular narrative. But I want to know, when you say that the culture hasn't changed, Professor Gumede, how would you change that culture now in the context of COVID-19, right? We can't wait 5 to 6 years to change it. In the context of right now, what mechanisms should the state be exploring? And what mechanisms should citizens be exploring around changing the culture of the military if they believe that this culture is not enforcing peace, but is actually causing harm?
I think a big part of it is, of course, oversight by citizens. If you see something, report it, distribute it publicly on social media. If you have a phone and you see abuse, you send the abuse on platforms so that everyone knows about it. Complain, even if you're the victim. Even normally, in these sort of situations, you may not even pick up the name of the individual officer because it's chaos and so on. You report it, and I think thirdly, go to courts. I mean, the person, for example, who was shot in Alex when his family went to the Constitutional Court. I think those type of actions, you know, the media should report on it, civil society should mobilize on it, and then people will have to be held accountable. So the military or the police must hold the individuals accountable and publicly accountable. So we know, say, we should know about them and there should be consequences. I think that's very important. And then from a parliamentary oversight point of view, I think, I mean, Parliament should have a little bit now start to get the house in order and play oversight. You know, if you're an elected representative, you look after the interests of citizens. That is if something goes wrong, you support citizens first and you take it up. So, you know, it's going to be very, very important. But also, of course, civil society, the media, ordinary citizens themselves, and then, you know, holding people accountable. In the long term, we really have to change the curriculum, you know, of the police and the military. And not only the curriculum, but also the focus. Of course, you know, a military is there to defend. So, you know, that we can't change that because that's what it is. But we need to bring in other kinds of things also now. We have to bring in things, you know, what is a military that is democratic? What is a military that builds? What is a military that educates? What is a military that lives the values of the Constitution in their, you know, in their engagement on the field?
Mute. You're mute.
Cool. So power was taken away from me unconstitutionally by someone, but I now have power again. Professor McCandless was making the point that Professor Gumede mentioned in his earlier remarks around capacity of militaries to enforce a lockdown, and the capacity of militaries, if that is lacking, that often they go back to authoritarian or authoritative mechanisms of enforcement across the continent. I'm curious from your research around militaries and securitization across the continent and across the world, actually, whether capacity plays a role and its impact on, and as you wrote in your paper, that idea of coercion and consent from communities and citizens, whether the military as an institution on the continent has the capacity, right, to get that consent from citizens, or whether they are forced to only use tactics that coerce citizens to obey. And the reason why I'm asking that is, in the context of a lockdown in South Africa, for many communities, there's a sense of not fully understanding what is happening, right? So the access to information around what COVID-19 is. The belief that even if I wanted to participate in the lockdown, it is not physically feasible for me to do that. I live in a one-bedroom house with 8 members of the family in it. And in that context, how does the military even begin to try and either get consent from citizens to participate? Or are they forced, because of the lack of that skill set, to just coerce people using physical means or some other type?
Good question. I mean, I think it's a mixed bag, and I think it's a work in progress. Certainly the military, you know, militaries across Africa have different levels of capacity, of course, and you know, I think SADC and AU, I mean, they're all there's a considerable amount of training and capacity building efforts that are constantly going into these efforts, including, you know, being driven by civil society, especially in South Africa. But I do think that, you know, you know, William was speaking to more the kind of accountability measures that need to take place of the military and the police force. And I think that, you know, that is really critical, and it has to be balanced with ongoing training and capacity development. Capacity development is not something that can just happen, you know, as a one-off. It has to be ongoing and continual. And these problems are not just, they're not just individual, you know, they're not just individual issues. They are structural and cultural types of violence that have to be addressed in numerous ways at numerous levels, you know, on an ongoing basis. And it's not just in South Africa, it's across Africa and across the world. That said, I don't feel that I am specifically a military expert on Africa, and I think we do have one here in the room, and it would be great to hear his thoughts, and that's our colleague Anthony Van Newkirk. So it'd be nice to hear a few words from him on this subject as well.
Yeah, and maybe we can get Anthony later on in this discussion. He has actually asked a question, and I want us to start getting down to that. When we talk about the militarization of South Africa, what we're really asking is it good or is it bad, right? I know I'm being very blunt about it, but what are the bad aspects of it, and what are the good questions of having a military within communities? Having militaries in communities in South Africa is not something that is fundamentally new, as we've seen by the deployment of the military in Cape Town back in 2015, as well as last year. But the question and just for the nuts and bolts, and this is to you, Professor Gumede, it's the idea of what should be the purpose of the military in a community, first and foremost, right? Should we justify the use of the military in the context of COVID-19, right? So we see from other country examples that the military is not present on the streets, right? How do we get to that point? And is there good that comes out of it?
No, absolutely. I think, I believe we should use the military in the crisis. And I know, in many other countries where they don't, because just from the point of our culture of non-compliance and so on. But I think maybe this is a really great opportunity to debate what is a military, in a developing country context in a constitutional democracy. And what does it mean if the military gets deployed at home in a crisis and also abroad in peacemaking? What is a democratic military? So, and for me, part of that democratic military would be to treat people with dignity. So we can't treat people in a way that other African, dictatorships in their military or the, apartheid era and so on. And then secondly, for me is, can we have a military that builds things? Is that possible? So military in the communities helping, building. So not just enforcing, but building and helping and educating. And then for me, thirdly, in a country like ours with its inequalities and lack of skills, the use of the military to train people to be technically, but also good citizens. So can we have somebody that joined the military and leaves the military as a Democrat and a democratic citizen? And, so I think those are the broader things maybe that COVID-19 opens up for us. So, but to conclude, having the military is not a bad thing, it's a good thing, it's deploying our resources in areas, but we have to think, how do we do that? The oversight have to get better. And in the long term, we have to really look at the culture of the military and the police.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you mentioned that. In a conversation having with some of my colleagues when the military came in, the question was, has the military been trained to go into communities and teach people about COVID-19 and inform people about it? Do they have that capacity? And that question is that the role of the military at all is very, very important. So I'm noting we are now getting a flurry of questions in the comments section. And I don't want to deny people. And I know Lynette has had a few questions. Some of them might not be relative to us. So for instance, there's a question from Lynette that we have some of our colleagues, for those who are new to us, there's some of our WSG colleagues who are actually in the chat who are also experts on this field. And I actually do want to, and maybe Anthony can either respond via this text actually to some of the questions. And the one that I picked out, if you just give me a second to find, it's from Lynette Pillay. And Lynette was talking about the idea of getting, sorry, I'm just trying to find it now. Yes, so the role, so Professor Gumede had kind of touched on it before, but explicitly the role of the IPID and the military ombuds during this period of time. I do know that the Democratic Alliance has come out recently saying that we need some sort of COVID-19 ombudsman of some point, of some sort, to help oversight or help institutions. The question that a lot of people, I guess, would throw back is, but there's already these institutions in place, and how do you better utilize them? And hopefully Professor Fanika can actually answer that, or Professor Gumede. For Professor McCandless, I'm very curious. So we've seen, and I know I don't want it to be too specific on South Africa, but what makes South Africa interesting and unique is the inequality. I live right now in a leafy suburb and I've not seen the military at all. I haven't seen them come down, call it drive, trying to make sure that people are staying at home, even though there's tons of people in this area who are not obeying the lockdown regulations. Why does it feel as if militaries are backsliding? At least the South African military is backsliding to say, we'll deploy in impoverished areas, we'll deploy in township areas. And what does that mean?
Well, I would like to hear others' opinion on that as well. I mean, I think it's a very sensitive question, obviously. And I mean, I'd like to think that one of the primary reasons is because these areas are high density, and there's a deep fear that if the virus gets out of control, it will have, it will just have a terrible effect on these communities. So, that's obviously an official kind of response. I would imagine also that there's just a history of different, there is a history of different approaches for different communities. And I think that is, hugely problematic in terms of creating both the actual objective and subjective reality of difference, right? Both economically and in terms of how people are treated. And these are actually really at the heart of poor social cohesion and frustration rising around government response. So I think it's actually one of the most important things to get right. And I was listening to one of the ministers today speaking about how the Constitution actually is very clear on these issues of treating everyone fairly and consistently. And so it's actually quite critical to get that right, while at the same time trying to ensure that there are careful and specific different approaches taken where it's actually needed. So.
And Professor Gumede, as Professor McCandless said, you would like to hear other people's views. And I'm looking at one of the questions here from, and I hope I don't mess up the name too much, Gechika Sabina, who noted, and I'll just read it verbatim here, just noted to say that he or she said, I appreciate the question from Professor Gumede is raising about reflecting on what the purpose of a military is in our times and the context in the first place. And the question is, she was looking at an article by Vuyo Sungula, who observed, at least on his Twitter page, and said that until I see white Indians getting the same treatment for breaking the lockdown rules, I will view the SANDF and SAPS as the enemy of the people. And Getchu's response is that he or she admits that it's the same thought that occurred to him or her. Right? Is there evidence that our military and police are brutalizing Black people in particular and specifically? And it is a question that I had previously posed to you, the distribution of the military and violence, and your comments on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be important that, in a part of the culture surf, that the military and the police treat everyone equally. I mean, you must remember, what was the culture that, that ran through the military and the police before 1994 was unequal treatment. If you were Black, you were treated, roughly, you were brutalized. If you're white, you were treated with kid gloves. So, I mean, it's going to be very important that the military and the police to be seen to be even, and so on. But I wanted to maybe also just sideways talk about consent. I mean, people ask a lot about in terms of, unfortunately, many governments, our government in South Africa prior to COVID-19, also many governments in Africa, don't have the moral authority to enforce voluntary consent, because they don't have the moral authority, because either, they're corrupt, incompetent, and don't deliver services to people. So because, how do you build, the moral authority and the consent by citizens, by delivering for them and, delivering services, delivering rights also, and being equitable, fair. I mean, all the conversations that we had now is just, if the government doesn't deliver services, if, governments squander public resources, corruption, there's no accountability. The government will have no moral authority to ask people to voluntarily comply. That is why people use the military. You know, countries that use the military, why are they using it? You know, they have no other, because, you know, corruption erodes the authority of governments to willingly get people to comply.
Mm. I mean, it's completely right. I think about the question of when does the military leave as well, right? That notion of at what level of lockdown do we now say the military can leave? Is that at a national level? Should it follow a particular protocol according to the level of lockdown that an area might be in? And the country hasn't yet started implementing this aggregated lockdown measure. So Western Cape being at level 4, whereas the Northern Cape could be at level 2. But Professor McCandless, how would you see an effective way of removing the military as the lockdown or as COVID-19 becomes less of a threat, but in a manner that still builds social cohesion?
Well, I think assuming the notion that the military and the police are effectively keeping the peace and keeping the order in particular communities, then as the order and the compliance, the willing compliance is being manifested and realized, and as we see, communities, ideally communities taking control themselves of their security and their controlling access and in a positive way. So as that capacity within the community is realized and manifest in a way that's easy, that's illustrative, then the security sector can be pulled out of these communities. Mm. But to be honest, it is problematic that we have far more security presence already in particular communities. And you're right, I live in a leafy suburb too, and I haven't seen the military here once. So yeah, it's slightly problematic. Yeah, very problematic.
Yeah, it speaks to the idea of how easy. So when I was talking to some colleagues around muscle memory, right? Professor Gumede described it as capacity for governments to deal with the pandemic. I describe it as the muscle memory for government. So South Korea and the Southeast Asian countries who went through SARS and MERS had the muscle memory to proactively react to this particular pandemic better than most other countries, right? And the question is whether South Africa has the muscle memory of send the military into communities if we think they might not, we don't know how to control them, and the only way we know how to do this is send the military. And then it does beg the question of after 94, whether that is the case. What is the rationale of it? There is a question here that isn't necessarily linked to the militarization, but I do want it to be noted by Darren Brookbanks around tracing systems being deployed by mobile technology. And to give someone an example, in Australia, for instance, Australia is using mobile technology at quite an effective rate to trace the spread of COVID-19 using almost a social aspect of platform, essentially. So I will self-proclaim that I have COVID-19 as a way of tracing. I will self-proclaim that I am self-isolating. Now, I know it doesn't fit in our conversation, but is there an opportunity for our military to be using new technologies? Are they being equipped with various forms of technology to help in tracing, to help in understanding the spread of this virus? Do you think there's any communication between the efforts of the military within the country and the Department of Health, and whether they are aligning those skills together? I don't know who to pose this to, so any one of you can take it on. Professor Gumede.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, if you look at our military and our police, one of the weaknesses of them, if you compare them to, to sort of other, sort of really very, very effective police services and military services, is we're not using technology better. I mean, whereas the police just ordinary detective work, technology now is actually where you solve crimes. We have limited capacity to do that. My fear is we may still sit with a pre-technology mindset or pre-1994 mindset of doing things, whether it is just simple detective work in the police or it is peace keeping abroad, where we don't use the technology. So I think it's going to be very important when we talk about the transformation of the culture of the police and the military. The technology and the use of technology should become actually, much more be part of both of these services. And then maybe thirdly, the integration, and specifically here with COVID-19 now, between different departments fighting COVID-19, because prior to COVID-19, there were very little coordination and integration between different departments to deal with a crisis. Yeah. So I wonder often, is it still a silo approach? Yes, there is there's a couple of coordinating committees. There's in cabinet and so on. Whether that is actually as effective, where we bring the technology with the military, with other things, other informations, like information, for example, of the food is not reaching the area, because that is where we want the military. When I say the military should do more proactive, we know, for example, there's a crisis of not getting food to people. So if we have the military, a different kind of military will actually then be deployed to take the food to the, to communities or to families. But that will demand also integration, mindset change, but also integration between the different departments, the social development department, the military, and the health department. Clearly, the issues that we see, the problems that we see, the food is not reaching people and so on. We don't know where the hotspots are and so on. It means that there's integration is lacking at a higher command to deal with COVID-19.
Yeah. So we're near the end of our chat today. And I know we could keep on going. I still have a few questions, but I do want to give the panelists the opportunity to give their closing remarks or comments. I've noticed we've answered quite a few of the questions in the chat, but Professor McCandless, if you don't mind, if you would just summarize your thoughts around the demilitarization or militarization of South Africa, what it looks like going forward in the context of COVID-19 and after that. I really appreciated your comment when you were mentioning if the SANDF and the SAPS do their job well, it might give a very good sign and indication to communities that these two institutions in a time of crisis are actually doing well and is something to be trusted. And maybe not SAPS, but maybe the SANDF in particular, that isn't often in these communities, might gain some new level of respect, some new level of belief in them. But just your closing remarks on this.
Okay, well, I think pretty much everything I've wanted to say has been said, and some really great questions and concerns and comments. I wish we could have more actual interaction. But I do think that really it comes down to better communication and more and more quality and better forums for interaction. I think that the SANDF and the police, there needs to be a much more highlighting and communication around the positive stories that are taking place and around the work that they are doing, and in particular around, what is their policy and approach to dealing with communities, and actually going out and talking with community forums and getting feedback. Is this the right approach? Like really engaging with different communities and finding out, what could we do better, and where are we doing well? And I do think that there needs to be some kind of conversation around fairness of approaches and explaining why there is more, of a military presence in townships rather than suburbs. I think we can all guess around this, but I think that, it should be explained and communicated in very clear ways. Community policing. Many more forums that help to help the police and the military interact at the local level with community is really, really key. I think just bringing it back to the social contract for a minute, in our research across 9 countries, one of the key findings was just around the mechanisms of the social contract, right? So what are the social compacting mechanisms? And, are they functioning well, right? And this is precisely about this, are there enough quality ways in which people groups, can communicate both vertically with the state and across with each other. And what we found across all of these countries is that they were really broken and incoherent. And, there was a real lack of continuity between, what the political settlement, and in this case, the transition, from apartheid, and we still say in South Africa that the transition is unfinished, right? So how are the mechanisms that, if we want to see, which I think we do, we want to see a continuity between crisis and longer term development and peace. We want to see a continuity between crisis driven policy imperatives and goals of transformation, right? The transformation goals that are at the heart of the National Development Plan. So how do we do that? We have to have concerted conversations and really looking at how do we ensure that those the mechanisms have continuity, the policies and the forums and the ways that people engage, and also understanding, precisely just this conversation on technology and social media, how do people at different levels and in different communities actually communicate, and what are the ways in which they receive information most effectively, and actually engaging those in effective ways. So I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
No, thanks so much. I think often people will talk about, after the 2008 financial crisis, all the brand new business innovations that came out. And often people don't talk about how society started changing after that, how austerity measures, Brexit, the rise of the right, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is, can we use this opportunity to rebuild those vertical and horizontal institutions after this crisis? Because an opportunity would be open. Professor Gumede, if you could give your closing remarks. Well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we really have to use COVID-19, to make the changes in our society and in our democracy that we want. I mean, and one of the things really is the oversight institutions. People talk about the ombudsman, I mean, the military or the independent complaints and the police. Now, the last couple of years, I must sadly say that, across our society, oversight institutions, official oversight institutions, has been either decimated by political appointees, by weak people, deliberately, and so on. So to play that oversight role. So that maybe, I think, is a good opportunity, again, that we strengthen that as society, as citizens, that we ensure that we participate to ensure that people are there with the competency and the courage. We can't have people who are pliant. When we need to defend the rights of citizens, we need courage, and we need people, when I say strong, strong in their democratic convictions, so that we cannot allow these ombudsmen and oversight institutions, to be staffed by deployees, weak or people just following the line. And then perhaps the last one, just to say that, I mean, there's actually a great opportunity potentially for both the police and the defense, to build trust. Because also we have a very low trust society in terms of institutions, because most of the institutions have failed across, from parliament downwards to local government. So here is one opportunity for the police and the defense force, to reinvent themselves as institutions of trust when other institutions fail.
And I do want to note, so there's it's in the conversation, a piece written by Professor McCandless and Professor Darlene Miller, and she has made a few comments in the chat for those who want to go through it, but I think it's something worthwhile to go through. And Professor McCandless had mentioned earlier the idea of toxic masculinity and how that plays into the discussion of militarization. I do want to assure people that these are the type of topics that we are going to be exploring later on in this webinar series in a couple of weeks. The role of masculine identities in a COVID-19 crisis, and how they play out when it comes to being in a home with an abusive father, being in a home with an abusive partner. What does it mean to have that over-toxic masculine identity within a police service who's supposed to help these communities? So I did want to acknowledge that. We are running out of time, but I do want to thank everyone for their participation in this first webinar of many that we hopefully will have over the next coming weeks. We are working out the kinks as we go along, but I hope you guys join us on this journey. I have also been told by the higher ups that you should also follow us on social media. You can follow us on Facebook at the Wits School of Governance, on Twitter at WSG, at Wits_WSG. So please look out for us on these various different platforms. We'll be giving out more content and more invites to more of these discussions, and please share that. And just as a further note, we have recorded this discussion, and hopefully we'll be distributing that to as many of you as possible as soon as possible. So once again, I do want to say thank you so much from the Wits School of Governance for joining us, and hopefully you can join us again as we embark on this adventure of figuring out how does this country survive this crisis, and how does this country survive going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, your comments, your questions. It's been such an amazing experience for all of us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. So please expect an invite from us pretty soon. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your weekends.